Dear friends and colleagues, a warm welcome from the European Movement's offices here in Brussels. My name is Petros, and I'm really glad to have you with us for the 7th edition of Talking Europe, a series of discussions organized in partnership between the European Movement and the European Commission in an effort to bring forward leading voices from the European Commission to discuss some of the key things that the EU is working on and how they affect the lives of citizens across our continent. For this event, we are very fortunate to have with us the Director General of DG CLIMA, Raffaele Mauro Petriccione, who has been leading the Commission's work on climate change and related policy areas. Raffaele, good morning. Thank you very much for taking time to join us today. As I mentioned, this is our 7th discussion, and we've had the pleasure of engaging with a whole host of leading voices from the European Commission. We're very happy to have you here with us.
Good morning, Petros. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here.
Splendid, splendid. Perhaps I can start our discussion with the European Commission's Fit for 55 package, which is expected, I believe, to be launched in June. What are the main tools and measures included in this package to address the fight against the climate crisis we are all experiencing?
We have accumulated over the years a lot of legislation which is relevant to reducing, eventually eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, the emission trading system is our backbone. It's a market for being allowed to emit CO2. If you want to be allowed, you have to pay for it. But we also have legislation which gives targets to member states. We have legislation on CO2 standards for cars, energy efficiency, encouraging renewable energy investment, a very, very large package of investment. And when a bit more than 2 years ago, we proposed a net zero greenhouse gas emission target for 2050, soon after we realized that in order to get there, we have to front load a lot more of the effort and also a lot more of the investment over the next 10 years. And we had just finished adopting all our laws for the minus 40 greenhouse gas emission target that we had endorsed, and then we realized that was not be good enough. So we proposed a 55 and at least 55 target. Our leaders have endorsed it in December last year, and we're going to propose, as you mentioned, all the legislation. So virtually, we are reviewing every piece of legislation which is relevant. There's a big main package, the elements I mentioned earlier. There's also regulation on the use of land, but it goes into all sorts of details. We will have a review of the Energy Taxation Directive. We will have a proposal on a border adjustment measure. We will have a review of the directive of alternative fuel infrastructure. So it really is everything, or virtually everything, which has a bearing on cleaner energy, clean mobility, decarbonizing industry, and using better our land to absorb more carbon and be more sustainable.
That is quite a substantial piece of work, and it really puts the European Union on the forefront in efforts to address the climate crisis. To what degree do you think other parts of the world are able to match this ambition? We've seen a welcome shift in US policy in this regard, and also China. And there is a lot of discussion about the need for those three superpowers in terms of climate mitigation efforts to align their work. Do you think that the leading role the EU is taking can be matched by other partners?
Well, we have struggled for years in being followed in acts rather than in words. And the past few years have been tough, with the US under the Trump administration being basically deliberately out of the game. But effort and perseverance are paying off. I think in the autumn last year, all of a sudden we started seeing all countries from all sorts of regimes and all sorts of political situation beginning to look at the science the way we have in 2018 and realizing action has become urgent and could not be postponed. So we had the flourishing of commitments of what the UN Secretary General called a net zero coalition. We had Japan adopting a strategy very, very similar to ours and the same objective of net zero 2050. China has made a commitment to be net zero in 2060. South Korea, Canada, a host of developing countries, and the very welcome news that the United States has rejoined the club. They also have declared a net zero 2050 target, exactly the same as ours. But more important, we're now beginning to see a movement towards changing policies for the 2020s, with 2030 targets which are conceived to put us on the path to net zero. We're not there yet, but we see, for instance, the commitment that the US took last month, 50 to 52% by 2030, puts the US basically in the same ballpark as Europe, finally, and we're extremely happy with that. Japan, 46%, Canada, 45%, almost there. Difficult, but I think we see a realization globally that things have to change. I think we've been the first to have that realization. We have very strong popular consensus in Europe, perhaps stronger than anywhere else, and I think we have to make the most of it.
You mentioned the need for a strong popular consensus for this kind of efforts to be successful. How are we making sure that our fellow citizens are on board in this fight? In which way are we able to both explain the science, the opportunities, but also the challenges in this transition that that Europe in general and the European Union in particular is going through?
Well, citizens are on board. I mean, there have been, politics in Europe have been progressive in this respect, but not everywhere, not massively until recently. What has changed things has been the fact that citizens are on board, and they've been pushing politics everywhere. Now, the question is how we manage not to lose them, because at the end of the day, people cannot worry all the time about the end of the world in 50 years' time. They need to worry about the end of the month. So we need to conjugate this transformation with the fundamental objective we have, which are, prosperity, a competitive economy, a lively economy, and a just economy, and a more equitable economy, because we all know that inequalities have been growing rather than shrinking in spite of all the effort. But at the end of the day, we're not going to stop climate change if we don't fundamentally transform our economy. Our economy is also the problem, but it's also the solution. So in the end, fighting climate change is not something additional. It is a different way to achieve the objectives that we want in our society. It's a different way to pursue growth, jobs, and employment. It's a different way and a cleaner way to pursue justice and equality. If we manage to bring all that together, then I think European citizens will stay on board because they don't want a future which looks increasingly fragile. The climate change is adding enormously to people's worry about their future of their children, whether their children will have a job. I think all this merges together, but the advantage is that's the only way to actually do the climate transformation. We cannot just put a patch on it. We have, just to give you one example, it's not good enough to find a way to continue burning fossil fuels and then finding a brilliant technology to take the CO2 and put it somewhere else. That could be a tiny part of the solution, but the real solution is to move massively to clean energy, Now, clean energy also happens to be the cheapest form of energy. And it happens to save Europe 270 billion euros a year in fossil fuel inputs. I mean, it's that kind of combination and synergy that will keep our citizens on board.
No, I think you actually hit the nail on the head there, and the need to explain and present how this is an opportunity as much as a challenge will make a difference. You mentioned the necessity for investment and the need to change our economy. And you agreed not so long ago a massive recovery plan, unprecedented value of investment that will go into helping the EU recover from the crisis we're going through, but at the same time also enable member states to reshape their economies. How do you see that this recovery plan that is in place can help the EU also achieve its objectives when it comes to climate change and protecting the environment?
Well, Petros, this time you have hit the nail on the head. I mean, this transformation is all about investment. It's investment in the obvious things, in technology, in infrastructure, in energy, but it's also investment in people, investment in skilling, reskilling, upskilling people for the jobs of the future, to move to, just to give an example, buildings. Buildings are one of the biggest sources of emissions in Europe nowadays, because the industry has made huge efforts in terms of energy efficiency. Our buildings are very inefficient, partly because they are historical buildings, parts of Europe have a legacy of a period where buildings were shoddy. Renovating these buildings, clean renovation, energy efficient renovation, means local jobs, skilled jobs, because buildings in the future are not going to be just bricks and mortar. They're going to be sensors, they're going to be technology, they're going to be energy production. So investment in people is also fundamental. Now, I confess, a year and a half ago, we were all working and say, okay, public finance are what they are. How do we make it attractive for the private sector to invest in the transformation? Clearly, in all event, most of the investment has to come from the private sector, including individuals, including ourselves, renovating our houses, or buying different cars than the one we buy. But then this crisis, like all crises, is a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity. When we decided we're going to do whatever it takes to make our economy recover, then it took a split second to decide that then the only recovery could be green recovery. And all of a sudden, we are now borrowing a massive amount of capital, which will enable the Union and the member states to prime the pump of investment, to adopt the programs that encourage private investment to come in, because we'll help them de-risk the initial investment, because we will build the infrastructure they need to be successful. But as the president has said several times, we are borrowing that money not from ourselves, we're borrowing it from the future generation. The least we can do is to spend that money for the kind of world the young generation are telling us they want, which is a greener world, which is a world where climate change is no longer a capital threat.
That's a powerful message, in fact, and it really puts things in perspective. I should say before we continue that all of you watching, you can share your questions in whichever platform you are following this discussion. And in fact, one of our viewers, Franco, asked something that links quite a bit with what we were just saying. His question is, what is the impact of the current pandemic on the debate around climate change? I think you touched upon it a little bit, but just to bring this point of view from Franco.
Well, at the beginning, there was the question, is this going to, well, I hate to use the word distract us, as if one was more important than the other. I mean, this is horrible enough and important enough not to use these words, but you know what I mean. We thought that the attention would move on the immediate crisis, and the longer term crisis would take second place. Not at all. I think most people in Europe have taken the current crisis as a signal that the world we are living in has become a lot more fragile, and that we need a lot more resilience to unwelcome change. And whether this is a pandemic, this one or the next one, because I'm afraid the risk that we will have other ones is there. And at the same time, how do we equip ourselves to be resilient to the longer term crisis we have, which is just as lethal in the longer term, except there are no vaccines for climate change. I think it's a proof of the depth of feeling and thinking of European citizens that they have not, without creating easy and undemonstrable links. But for most people, these are all facets of the same problem. We have a society which is not resilient, which works as if the outside world would never interfere, and we're in absolute control. But we're not. And the outside world will continue to interfere. How do we cope? How do we equip ourselves? Apart from the fact that, climate change may not cause directly a pandemic, but it is beginning to cause very serious health problems. We have recently launched an observatory on health and climate to try and understand better the links. But the increase in temperature, respiratory problems, the easier circulation of diseases, which were then confined by weather patterns. This is all going to come if we don't act.
And of course, as well as the health effects related to climate change, there is also the effect it has on security, not least the mass movement of population that we have experienced over the past few years can easily be linked to some of the effects of climate change. How do you see the short, medium, and long-term future in that regard? Do you believe that climate change will pose serious challenges for Europe and the world at large because of these population movements caused by it?
Well, climate change has already posed those challenges. Well, where do you think the crisis in Syria came from? Much as we may not like to admit it, Syria had a stable regime, not perhaps our favorite regime, but a stable one. What destabilized Syria was serious damage to agriculture. People flocked into the cities and looking for jobs and not having jobs. And that destabilizes any regime. Now, what happened afterwards is not the fault of climate change. But if Syrian agriculture had not been damaged by a series of droughts, things might have been different. Just to give you one example, it's always difficult to distinguish among all the causes of things, and which has delayed the recognition of the importance of climate change. Weather has always been changeable. Well, not to this extent. And the migrations from North Africa, for instance, yes, it is due to deteriorating economy. Climate change is one of the causes of the deteriorating economy. So the problem is there. Now the answer is always the same. If we don't want to have massive migratory problems, we have to support countries to make life better at home. Nobody wants to emigrate because they want to emigrate. Most people emigrate because they have to. If you help them have jobs and livelihood at home, most people don't even dream of leaving home except as tourists. The fighting climate change in these countries is the same logic, which is why we are increasingly focusing on adaptation to climate change. Not because adapting is a way to avoid the action that we need to mitigate climate change and to stop it, but because even the best scenario, 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, which is the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement, even that is not a pretty world. We are already at 1.2 globally. in parts of Europe, we've gone well beyond 1.5 average degree, and it's not pretty. So before we stop climate change, things are going to get worse. We have to keep it manageable, but they will worsen. And then how do we adapt? Well, how do we help agriculture in most of Africa adapt to climate change? How do we adapt our own agriculture? Because if you see the projections, if nobody did anything about climate change, at the end of the century, the only arable land in Europe may be Norway. Now, we trust we're not going to get there, but that's the scale of the problem. Imagine Africa. Imagine Asia with its need for food and its population growth. So I think working on adaptation as we work to stop climate change and working on development are two facets of the same thing.
Indeed. And I think also that's where the challenge is for policymakers. Like you said earlier, the European electorate has been by and large favorable towards efforts to reform and change, be more kind to the environment. But there is this other side effects that are harder, and we've seen how the migration crisis, for a lack of a better term, has had an effect on politics in a variety of electoral contests. And I guess I want to follow up a little bit the point that you made earlier. Is there a link, you think, that those side effects of climate change might compromise our fellow citizens' commitment to policies that are good for the environment and perhaps lead them towards other more populist or extreme voices?
Well, okay, I mean, I'm convinced there are only two really big movers of the electorate or public opinion. And one is fear and the other one is opportunity. Yes, the fear of climate change now is, and its consequences, is pushing people in that direction, but fear is not a good motivator. It's not a constructive motivator. I mean, the real challenge for us, for the political class, for the administrators, for the bureaucracy that support the political choices, is can we offer the opportunities? There is a threat. There's no need to scare people. The threat is there and scary enough. That isn't the real point for government. The real point is, what do we do about it? We cannot escape. There is no other planet to escape to. You can migrate as much as you like. Climate change will catch up with you. If not with you, with your children. The question is, do we have the ability, the intelligence, the resources to offer opportunity, which is working to stop climate change while building up our economy, while keeping it competitive, modernizing it, and making it more equitable. Because at the end of the day, a perfect green economy, which is more inequitable than the one we have, isn't likely to be very popular. So I think, if we go back to the beginning of this conversation, the whole package that we are working on is predicated, once again, on investing in the future. Now, investment is not a cost, but it still requires money. We have some of that money now. We're borrowing much of it. But if you invest the money you borrow, you can be successful. I think the whole political nexus in Europe now is about how much can we make the fight against climate change an opportunity to create more jobs than the one that we may lose because certain activities may have to be phased out. And so far it's working. We are creating more green jobs than the jobs that are lost because activities like coal mining are in decline. The challenge is that it's not the same people at the same time in the same region. So how do we organize the fact that we have industries and regions that are growing on the back of green technologies and others that are declining? Because their brown technology is no longer desirable, or not as desirable as it was. It is a big challenge, but on the other hand, even business as usual has activities going up and down, except we don't control that. We are victims of that. So at the end of the day, the choice that we have is we are going to have transformations. We are going to have change. It's going to happen to us. Do we submit or do we drive it?
Indeed, quite. And I think the choice couldn't be starker. Going back a little bit to the global partnerships that we need to strike to be able to be successful in this colossal effort. One of our viewers is asking what role trade agreements can play. Could they be a leverage for change? How can the EU perhaps reconcile its climate and trade policy and use its trade deals and the significant muscle it carries in those negotiations to achieve its climate goals?
Well, Vanessa, I'm skeptical about trade agreements, and I know a little bit about them. I spent 30 years negotiating trade agreements. They can do many things, but they cannot do miracles. The real question is, how can trade help the change? I think we need to change our trade patterns. Now, trade agreement might help in that. Just to give you a very stark example, we are working to create a hydrogen economy, a green hydrogen economy. Now, no matter, at the same time, we're working to electrify massively our economy. All this with renewable sources. No matter how much sun and wind you may have in Europe, we're not likely to have the ability to do all this at the same time. We should start working now to replace importing fossil fuels with importing green hydrogen, and look at North Africa. At the moment, we import natural gas from Algeria. Tomorrow, we could import green hydrogen from the whole arc of countries in North Africa, who have all huge potential for these technologies. We already are leaders in importing sustainably produced food. It's complicated, it's not perfect. Sustainability criteria are complicated and they are prone to be controversial, but we're doing it and we're doing increasingly well, and we are the largest importer in the world of this product. We should continue that way. We should continue with our purchasing power to support sustainable agriculture in other parts of the world, as we're trying to do it for ourselves. And again, the fact that we are far from being 100% there should not deter us from the effort. But I think trade can be a powerful instrument for the transformation. Whether trade agreements themselves are a tool, there will probably have to be very different trade agreements than the one I and others have negotiated in the past.
One of our viewers, Valentin, would like to probe a little bit on your point about how can we achieve climate crisis mitigation together with growth and opportunities. And I think Valentin's point is that actually feasible? And do we perhaps need to revisit the idea of growth and perhaps apply different indicators when measuring growth? Is the Commission working on this? Is this something that perhaps the EU can lead on, changing the way we perceive growth and perhaps take other factors into consideration when calculating?
Well, we certainly are, but let's be careful. The notion that we have to first change the fundamentals and then act is a very dangerous one. The fight against climate change could be profitable in the most classic sense of the way. If you start really counting the costs, the current economy isn't profitable. I mean, environmentalists have been arguing for a true accounting of the cost of economic activities for decades. We're finally getting there. I mean, the emission trading is a way to make economic activity accountable for what they actually do. the fact that the emission from industry are not directly attributed, or the emission of factory X does not immediately affect me as customer in buying the product of factory X, doesn't mean I'm not suffering. Because I'm a citizen and I'm suffering from the effect of climate change. Emission trading means you are creating a cost for the community, you pay for those costs. And this philosophy changes the situation. Our industry has been investing for years in reducing that cost. Is it enough? No. We will have a stronger emission trading in a couple of years' time, and that cost will go up. And the effort of industry to avoid that cost is going to go up. So the first thing we need to do is to account for what's happening now, and that can be done with the instruments we have. Now, I'm not saying that it is not a good idea to replace GDP with other indicators that are more reflective of what we really want in life, which is not money per se, but money as an instrument for a better life. But we don't need to wait for that to act. Even with instruments of the economy as we know it, if we account things properly, we can change things. We can bring about change, and then if we proceed in changing our measurements, that can only strengthen our action in the future.
You mentioned emissions and the cost of emissions, and Chris from Norway makes the point that EU carbon markets have hit an all-time high, 50 euros per ton, in fact, and as a result, polluting has never been as expensive. Is the EU ETS a model that can be replicated elsewhere in the world, and how can we take advantage of the opportunities it offers?
Well, Chris, if you are if you have an insane passion for figures, go and look at the impact assessment that we published in September last year, and you will see the 50 euros a ton is only the beginning. And yes, it can be replicated. Will everybody replicate it? I'm not sure. Are there other tools? For sure. But it is being replicated. I mean, one of the most encouraging developments is that China, of all places, has just launched an emission trading system. Now, it's at the beginning. It has flaws. It will hit teething problems galore. But hey, ours is barely 15 years old. And I can assure you, we've gone through all the loops of teething problems, prices going as far down as 5 years. Well, when I took up this job more than 3 years ago, the carbon was at 5 euros a ton. Now, I like to joke that it's all because of me that's gone up. It's a little bit excessive. But the reality is that we've been working for 15 years to make it work better, and we think we finally managed because we made some important changes to the system. So China is creating a system which is for now rudimentary, it's tentative, it only applies to energy and not to industry, and even so, it is a lot bigger than ours. China has a plan to extend it to 7 or 8 areas of industry and services, and it will become a huge instrument to abate emissions in China. We'd like the Chinese to do it a lot faster because the problem keeps accumulating, so we're not entirely happy with how much China is doing, but China is going in the right direction, and we're trying to nudge them and to persuade them to go a lot faster. The US, paradoxically, the homeland of markets is not thinking of an emission trading, But California has one, older than ours, which works very well. Some other states have emission trading. Quebec has emission trading. So there is plenty out there, and it's a growing community. And we are doing a lot of work to offer assistance and consultation. I mean, we had a massive program of support to China to explain to them how you set up an emission trading. So very useful instrument. It will spread. Will it become the instrument of choice worldwide? I don't know, I'm not sure. And there are alternatives if people want to do it. You know, a carbon tax is a perfectly good alternative. You have to have the political authority to impose a tax and to adapt it all the time to change the circumstances and to make it stricter and stricter and stricter. Some countries do, others don't. In Europe, we found that a market which is self-regulating and if properly framed, works best for us.
If I may, you know, we have the COP26 coming up, and one of our viewers, Carl from the UK, in fact, would like to ask whether this is an opportunity for the EU and Britain to align their climate action in order to be successful. Do you think this is indeed an opportunity, especially in the context of Britain's recent departure from the EU? And what should be our joint priorities ahead of COP26?
Well, I will bite my tongue and resist any temptation to comment on Brexit. Inter alia, some of my thoughts are not printable. But if there is one area where Brexit does not seem to have damaged alignment of values, of objective and policy, that's climate change. We are not perceiving any change in change of heart in what our British colleagues are saying and doing. And so we are confident that this will be a strong COP presidency. Fortunately, because this is going to be a very difficult COP, more difficult than usual. So having a strong and motivated presidency is reassuring. We're working very closely with the British presidency. One of the problems is that we have almost finished the, not easy, but the easily identifiable jobs. We had the Paris Agreement, then we had an implementation program. There are a few bits which are not complete, but by and large it's been done. Now the question is, what do we do to make sure people actually use it? The big focus is on, and we've started last year, the whole focus was on long-term goals, because we have realized that having a long-term goal has radically changed the way we do policies today. I don't think we've worked out entirely all the implications of having an objective with a 30 years horizon, and now that objective is going to be enshrined in law with the climate law and the political agreement which has been reached on that. And I'm hoping tomorrow to see that formally endorsed by member states. So that was the focus, and all of a sudden people started accepting that was the right thing to do. Well, we haven't finished the job. Now the job this year and in Glasgow is going to be, what's your plan to get to that lofty objective in 2050? What are you going to do now over the next few years? What's your investment? What's your regulation? How are you going to be stricter on emissions? That's the 55 package for us. The UK has given itself a target, which is basically what the UK would have done to contribute to 55% at European level if it had stayed a member state. So no diminishing of ambition at all, and others are giving themselves adequate targets for 2030, but not enough. nowhere enough. China doesn't have a target for 2030 which fits with the objective they've given themselves for 2060. They're not there yet. How do we persuade them? And that's much more difficult, paradoxically, than negotiating a legal text. So it's a very tall order for this COP presidency. They're multiplying initiatives. They're working on phase out, or at least on the export of coal technology. And there is a huge debate on finance, where developing countries have expectations which are not being entirely fulfilled about receiving support in terms of climate finance. But at the same time, there's a fundamental ambiguity which needs to be dispelled. Like for us, climate change is not something additional for which you need extra money. Climate change is something that changes the way you act, and therefore the way you spend your money, the way you invest. It has to change the way, the manner of our support to developing countries, all of it, because we want to help these countries develop, but we want them to develop in a sustainable manner and in a resilient manner. Some countries have embraced this philosophy faster than others. And that's going to be a very difficult discussion on climate finance in Glasgow. Partly because, as usual, there is never enough money for all that's needed. So that's always a difficult discussion. But partly because there's fundamental ambiguity about what is the money for.
Perhaps we can organize another discussion off the record on Brexit and EU-UK relations, because I would be interested to hear.
Very off the record.
Indeed. When we can meet in person, perhaps we do it in private.
Or you wait until I retire, and then I will have no constraints.
By the looks of it, that will be a long way ahead. So we can find a method. But you mentioned the EU climate law that recently the Council and the Parliament reached a provisional agreement on. And indeed, this is a quite important step in the EU's efforts. Do you think this tool can really help us reach our targets for 2030 in terms of the carbon neutrality we're trying to achieve? Absolutely. Are the member states there?
Absolutely. Look, we started with a symbol. At the beginning, this was to be a symbolic act, which is not without value. It's like, why do countries have a constitution? Technically, you don't need constitution. You do it because it puts certain principles, certain things on a higher plane, and you look up at them. And that's what the objective with the climate law, something which in a more detailed manner than a treaty provision would give us the objective, the framework, the aspiration for the future. It turned out to be a lot more concrete than that. There are provisions now which not only say 2050 net zero is an obligation. You must reach it. How? Figure it out, but you must. There are aspirations for what we do afterwards. And because the scientific advice is not limited to 2050. The scientific advice that we have, for instance, from the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the body that basically brings together almost all the climate scientists in the world, is you start with net zero, and then you start taking carbon out of the atmosphere, because the objective, the ultimate objective, it'll be for 3 generations from now, 3-4 generations from now, is to actually restore the climate, not simply stop climate change. Stop climate change is the task for our generation and the next. Afterwards, we have to start taking things back. Climate law has that now. The Union has the aspiration to contribute to taking things back after 2050. Adaptation. Now it is an objective of the Union, legally solid objective. It's not mandatory in the detail, because adaptation is an incredibly complicated subject. It's not as easily brought to a target like net zero, but we must pursue adaptation policies. The Commission has just presented a new adaptation strategy, but that's a policy document. It's this is what we think we should do, and member states are very likely to endorse it, and that's probably what we will do. But having this law that tells us adaptation is part of your long-term goals, and you have to do it all the time, and this is only a first step, and you have to continue to do it, it's important. And even the 2030 cap is now in the law, so it's not just a political decision of our leaders, which is binding enough, because not many people ignore what the heads of state and government have endorsed. But now it will be in the law. It will be in the law with limitation to make sure it's for real, that we don't exaggerate in trying to compensate emissions with the carbon sink, but our primary objective is to eliminate emissions, because we will never have a carbon sink that can compensate more than a small part of small quantity of emissions. I think it's going to have a very practical role, and again, it's going to change the way we do policies now, because this is no longer something that the next generation of leaders can overturn. The next generation of leaders will take this as a given. It's in the law. Of course, Council and Parliament may change any law, but you need a proposal by the Commission, and you need consensus in Council and Parliament. Not very likely to change overnight on an issue of this magnitude. So I think it will have a real impact, and the measure of which we will have to take over time. I think these things have a habit of acquiring a life of their own, and this is only the beginning.
Yeah. And I think this aspect is indeed the most important one, future-proofing the EU's efforts to ensure that following generations of politicians don't reverse perhaps as easily as they might wish. I know we're running out of time. We have already taken quite a bit of space in your calendar, but there are quite a few questions coming in from our audience still. And actually, two of our viewers, Stefan and John, are asking pretty much the same question, so I will bundle them together. It has to do with the effect of the EU's efforts might have on our competitiveness. And both of them would like to ask to what degree the carbon border adjustment mechanism can help in that regard to protect EU industry from unfair competition from parts of the world that might not be as ambitious in the climate efforts as we are.
Well, obviously, we hope it will help. Otherwise, we wouldn't be proposing it. But it's an experiment. It's new. It's never been done before. It's been talked about forever, for all sorts of reasons. But it's actually never been done. So it does remain a bit of an experiment. But we are confident that it will help. But it's not going to fix the problem, in the sense that we have to deploy a range of instruments, not only at the border. I mean, the first thing we have to do is to find the equivalent of what we use for renewable energies, where with public support programs, which were in the end not terribly expensive, and which could be modulated, in the sense that as the market was growing and finding its own legs, support could be reduced or withdrawn. We have to find the same for technologies like green hydrogen, green steel, green cement. That goes together with protecting those green industries, nascent industries, from unfair competition. And then this initiative is already having a very positive impact, in the sense that many countries in the world are being forced to ask themselves the question, how green are we? Are we going to be hit by these measures that Europeans are mulling over? And all of a sudden, when governments start asking themselves how green are our products, their citizens start asking the same question, because it becomes part of the public debate, and that's beginning to change things. It will be very difficult, because we will open consultation with anybody who wants them, and many do. And the question will be, how green is your system? How much greener are you going to get? Are you in the same ballpark as we are, so that we can consider that you're not being unfair to us? That alone was worth taking the initiative. Then we'll see how we can make it work. Once the proposal is out, I expect that this is going to be one of the most hotly debated proposals in a package, which is going to be hotly debated overall. But as I said, I hope it will help. For the rest, if we don't apply border measures, we will continue our current system, which is very effective. When industry doesn't pay for all its emission. Some of the allowances are given them for free. We would like to eliminate that eventually, because it will, without that, the emission trading will be much more effective and act much faster. At the same time, we do want to keep an industry. We want a green industry, but we want an industry. And if you look at our long-term strategy, the communication Clean Plan for All that we published at the end of 2018, which is the heart of all this, the subtitle talks about a modern, competitive, prosperous, climate-neutral Europe. None of this word is subordinated to the others. Not because we are trying to be comprehensive, but because we are truly convinced that if you don't have all these things together, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in practice, and it's not going to work in politics, and it's not going to work at the ballot box.
If I may ask one last question, and of course you won't be surprised, it has to do with the Conference on the Future of Europe, something that we have taken a great interest in. Do you think this new platform, this new initiative that is about to be launched later this week, is an opportunity to also deepen the discussion between policymakers and citizens, and involve citizens a little bit in what the EU does in general, but especially in particular when it comes to climate change? Do you think the conference can offer that platform for discussion?
Of course it must. Look, I mean, I don't want to be a catastrophist. I'm not a catastrophist. I was born an optimist. I will die an optimist. But if we don't change, we don't stop climate change, there will not be a European society. There'll be a mess, not only in Europe, but everywhere else. When we talk about the future of Europe can only be a greener future. That's the only way we're going to continue to be successful and prosperous. So, of course, this is going to be part of that discussion. But the Conference of Europe is going to be about the goals, the objective, the vision of the future that we want for this Europe of ours. There must be other platforms for the nitty-gritty, for the more concrete things. And if you allow me a little spot of self-promotion, look at the Climate Pact. It was an initiative that was promised by President von der Leyen. We have launched it last autumn, and we're in a sort of, a beta version, and we are now building on it. And it's going to be the platform for concrete initiatives, for people who have something to say about climate, to find people who agree with them, with whom they can federate, with whom they can work together, whom they can emulate. It's a place where pledges can be exchanged. It's a place where experiences can be exchanged. It's a place where things can be made to grow together. And we are creating a very strong link with the European Covenant of Mayors, who is one of the linchpins of the of climate action at the local level. So you will have also an articulation of that platform, which is not time limited, with the Conference of Future of Europe, which is about taking a pause and looking at, okay, more than 60 years on, what is it that we want from Europe? What is the Europe we want? And I think we have been very, very explicit. And I think this is true for all the institutions, is the Europe we want is fundamentally a green Europe.
That is a quite powerful way to end the conversation. You've been a remarkable guest, answered all the questions from a variety of sources very accurately and openly, and we were going back and forth on a variety of issues. So I can only thank you for giving us the time, but also sharing your knowledge and expertise. The purpose of these discussions is to enable our viewers around Europe to experience firsthand some of the things that the European Commission is doing, and I think we achieved that goal very well indeed. So thank you very much. We hope to see you again, perhaps in person, not before long. But in the meantime, good luck with your work.
Petros, many, many thanks, and thank you for the opportunity. And my thanks to all the viewers and those who've asked questions. It is very valuable for me and for my colleagues to get out of the how we do things, to have a conversation about why we do them. It is, first of all, it helps with your mental sanity. And secondly, it helps you keep things in perspective. So many, many thanks for the opportunity, and best of luck for the future of the program.
Indeed, thanks a lot. And dear friends, thank you also for joining in. There will be more discussions like this coming up, so follow our social media and our website for announcements. In the meantime, enjoy what's left of the week and see you very soon. Goodbye.